Awesome. Thank you, everybody, and welcome. I appreciate everybody's time. Go ahead, Kathleen. Sorry, I got excited.
No, that's okay. Yes, welcome everybody. Thank you to all who are joining us. Some might be joining us for the first time. Welcome back to those who have joined us previously to our November session of our Erie County Department of Mental Health Workforce Collaborative Training Series. We're very excited today to have our own Sarah Bonk with us. She is our new Emergency Response and Disaster Coordinator for our Erie County Department of Mental Health. And she's here with us today to talk about preparing for preparedness, which is great timing, seeing that some of us got lots of snow last night. Um, just a few reminders. At the end of this session, we'll be asking everyone to complete a very brief evaluation. So please take a moment to fill this out so that we can continue to improve our training series. Stay tuned for more information on our training for December. We are in the process of finalizing some details. For future sessions, we'll be sending out those announcements, or you can always go to our erie.gov/mental health website for announcements and registration information. All of our presentations and recordings for our past offerings are posted on our website as well, and we'd encourage you to check those out. The recording and slides from today's presentation will be posted to our website in the next few days. Amy and I are in the works of setting up our training calendar for 2024. So if you are interested in doing a 1-hour presentation, or if you're interested in a particular topic, we want to hear from you. We love having presenters from our community, so please indicate that on our evaluation, or you can email Amy at amy.rockwood@erie.gov. Our training is being recorded today and everyone is muted. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat box. And I will be monitoring the chat during the presentation. And if you have questions, I will make sure those get to Sarah. Thank you all again for joining us today. I'd like to introduce Sarah Bonk to talk a little bit more about preparing for preparedness. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you very much, Kathleen. I appreciate it. And welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. Again, my name is Sarah Bonk. And as Kathleen had mentioned, please put your questions in the chat. This is really meant to be very conversational in that I want people to feel empowered to be able to ask questions, because I'm sure you are certainly not the only one to have those questions, particularly when we talk about that interface of emergency services, homeland security, and mental health, as well as the global service providing community. So there are a couple intentions that I really wanted to set from the get today for this particular training. There's a lot that I want to be able to communicate to this audience. Prior to working for the last year and a half in the Erie County Department of Homeland Security and Emergency Services, my start actually was within the Buffalo City Courts program, working under Judge Russell as an intern. And then I had the privilege to move to crisis services and really work in that crisis first response community. From there, I moved to Endeavor, where I was able to really fine tune and polish what it means to build a team and co-response, and really learn the intricacies of how to build sustainability within new program development. So after I did all that, I took a break, went into the Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Services for the county, and really learned about a whole new world. And I want to make sure that we share a little bit about that today, just so that you have the information and resources necessary to really make sure that we're helping those people in the community that we're coming into contact with. But I also want to offer a little bit of a framework on what it means to be a service provider, and what that means to take almost a little bit of a clinical lens off of the work that we do, and really look at how can we engage with people on a one-to-one basis in a way that promotes their long-term resiliency, and really ensuring that we're surrounding communities with appropriate support. And of course, no training in this area would do service, especially from a social work perspective, if I wasn't talking about a little bit about what to expect when we encounter distress or situations of emergency or extreme states of stress. And so there's a lot of information that's going to come to you today. I have a tendency to speak very quickly, so please do not hesitate to ask questions. If Kathleen doesn't get the question in the moment that you asked it, Kathleen, maybe raise your hand for me and I'll try to pay attention. Admittedly, I get excited about topics, so sometimes I get going pretty quickly. But one of the first things that I noticed kind of as a system, and when I talk about a system here, I'm talking about the Homeland Security system, is that its history is fairly brief and recent, especially in comparison to some of the other service systems that exist. Particularly if we look at the mental health system, we could argue that some of the origins of the mental health system start in the 1800s. And really, when we look at the origin of the Homeland Security infrastructure in the United States, we're looking very specifically at September 11th, 2001. And it was after that terrorist attack that the directorate, or excuse me, a director of Homeland Security was appointed on a national scale. And it ramped up very quickly to balloon to what we now see as a sector of the government with over 240,000 employees. So we've seen a big growth of this community within a short amount of time. And arguably, as a system, and I'm going to talk about it from the perspective of the mental health system, there have been a lot of things that have occurred from our framework in a longer span of time. We had a major movement in our mental health community years prior to 2001. We had an experience of having government regulations. Then in 1996, we had the signing of the Mental Health Parity Act, which was another iteration of learning lessons from decades worth of mistakes and decades worth of growth and decades worth of shaping a system. And then we continue to see the growth and the need to expand into other areas. So really, I say this to illustrate the point that the world of Homeland Security and emergency services, when it was developed, combined 22 different government agencies, inclusive of Border Patrol, ICE, and some other agencies. When they did that, they were forced to work together really collaboratively in a short amount of time. And I say that just to say that I would argue those of us who have experience working in a service provider community may have more experience from a systemic and institutional perspective to be able to offer our assistance to the Homeland Security sector. So I really want to illustrate that point just to set the stage of there are a lot of language differences between the missions of Homeland Security and the missions of a mental health or service system. But ultimately, at the end of the day, both are really here to protect life and safety. And so I just wanted to take a moment to ensure that we were talking about these two systems from that framework. But ultimately, it did get pretty specific. So when it was formed, the Department of Homeland Security, as I had mentioned, kind of enveloped within it 22 different branches. And as noted here, these are the examples, excuse me, as of 2003 of the departments that were folded within this window. But I stress this point because it's important in terms of financial implications, and it's really important in terms of policy and directorates, because what that does is it establishes a chain of command for us here at the local level about what we can do from a Homeland Security and emergency services perspective in a regulatory manner. So for example, under the Department of Homeland Security on a federal level, there's a lot of funding that is set aside for a variety of initiatives. Some of those initiatives include climate equity, they include national security, they also include initiatives like increasing critical infrastructure. So the federal government releases a variety of policies and money to go with it through grants. That money is then filtered down through the individual states. In New York State, that money filters through our Department of Homeland Security and Emergency Services and then goes out into the individual counties across the state to the Departments of Homeland Security and Emergency Services across the state. And that's where I narrow our focus now is on the Erie County Department of Homeland Security and Emergency Services. So locally, it can be a bit confusing because there's a lot of name redundancy you might see. There's a lot of repetitive names and acronyms. So it can be really confusing when it comes to information and who you're getting information from. So for the remainder of today's presentation, I'll be speaking from the perspective of the local Erie County Department of Homeland Security and Emergency Services. And so I just wanted to make sure to share a little bit of that information. But while I'll be speaking from that perspective, everything that we do in Homeland Security and Emergency Services for Erie County really sits under the guise of the New York State municipal law, specifically Article 2B. And if you notice, it outlines a really specific definition of what it means to be a disaster. And that becomes a really important part of how we deploy services. And when I say we, I mean the Department of Homeland Security and Emergency Services. And so I won't read it, but if you know on the screen, that definition of what is encompassed in a disaster is pretty inclusive to a wide variety of incidents. And that's really important when we look at that distinction between what are we responding to and what is the size or the scalability of that incident. Excuse me. So I get a lot of questions about, okay, we understand maybe what happens in what we call gray sky days or storm incidents. But what are those activities that the Department of Homeland Security and Emergency Services is responsible for during what we call blue sky days, or the days in between when there isn't an active disaster? And there's a lot that's going on in that department. The main responsibility of the Department of Homeland Security and Emergency Services in Erie County is really to ensure that it's operating as that supportive link to the emergency services and first response community. So it operates as that linkage point, that communication infrastructure network between law enforcement, fire, City of Buffalo, Erie County sheriffs, excuse me, and the 92 other PSAPs that we have throughout Erie County, or those oh, I'm going to forget what PSAP stands for, excuse me, but the dispatching center and the personal safety answering points, that's what it stands for. So those are 92 different points at which people can call an emergency function and get access to services. So there's a lot of things that the department will do, including managing grants and setting the expectations, also working through the community comprehensive emergency planning program. And as a part of my job, working with this department is to really help local nonprofits evaluate their current disaster continuity of operation plans and provide the assistance to the agencies within their development and kind of re-networking of those plans. So that's something that agencies can also expect to see from me moving forward. But the department also does a lot of really interesting response activities. So excuse me, within the Department of Emergency Services, there's a couple different divisions, and there's a couple different teams within those divisions that really do operate in more response sort of capacity. So the Protective Service Division is our building guards, and they work at a couple of our different county locations. Our Division of Fire Safety works to set the training expectations, standards, and bring training in for our local volunteer fire department, and they work in partnership with the City of Buffalo to train their fire department. Our Homeland Security is our main wing that manages a lot of the grants. Our hazmat team works regionally with a lot of the chemical plants that are along the Niagara frontier and along the lake. And we also coordinate a regional tech rescue team, which is that fellow that's kind of suspended up there in the corner from that tripod, is elite rescue teams. They work together as part of local volunteer fire departments that are able to rescue individuals if they need be. So there's a lot of things that, again, during blue sky days or when there is not a current disaster, that the Department of Homeland Security is working on. But truly, the face of that department is really observable during an active disaster, particularly during snowstorms. This time of year is probably, yeah, I would argue to say the department's busiest time, but there's a lot of confusion that also comes around this time of year as well. What I mean by that is the weather changes pretty rapidly, and so does the communication around that weather. So today, for example, there is a travel advisory that is out. An advisory is something very specific and very different than a travel ban. And it can be really complicated when we start to hear some of these phrases and words. What's the difference between an advisory and a ban? And, there's a good chunk of us that might know that, but the reality is the vast majority of people don't know the difference of these terms. And that's okay, because I certainly didn't up until I started working with the department. So I say that to talk a little bit about what a ban is and kind of what that means and how the department goes to operate or kind of execute a driving ban. So in order for any type of ban to be issued, whether it's a boil water notification because there's a consuming water ban, or there is a travel ban, in order to do that, there has to be an emergency order that has been issued. But in order for an emergency order to be issued, there has to be a state of emergency declared. So essentially, there cannot be a travel ban or a government issued ban if there isn't a state of emergency issued. Now, traditionally, that would become fairly simple if we lived in one big town that encompassed all 960,000, give or take, individuals. But there's a little complication. Actually, there are a couple complications with that, particularly in Erie County. One of the things that we know is that each individual municipality is able to declare their own state of emergency based on that New York State threshold and definition of what a disaster is. If an individual municipality reaches a certain threshold financially of assumed damages, they are able to, or if that's used in a calculation and along with damages and a couple other factors, they're able to declare a state of emergency and then from there issue emergency orders and specific bans. So we could see a state of emergency issued for the town of Boston, for example, but we may not see a state of emergency issued for the town of Orchard Park. So that becomes pretty difficult for us then when we try to operationalize resources and plows into certain areas, because on top of each town having their own ability to make these rules, we also get to experience really crafty snowmads in Western New York, meaning they come in pretty specific isolated areas and they don't always touch the entire county. Today, I'm giving this presentation from my home in Colden, and it's a little gnarly at the moment, but I don't know if I could say the same thing for the folks out in Lancaster right now, because again, how that weather is created is vastly different. So there could be, hypothetically speaking, a state of emergency declared where I am, but not necessarily where somebody else is or a client. And that's something we might need to be aware of kind of in those communications. So it can be really confusing. So again, an advisory means it's really dangerous. You probably should not be out driving. And a ban is where it can actually be an enforceable act if you decide to act against it. So I say all that to say, right, we at a county level then have to make big decisions during big incidents that span across the entire county. And it's a tricky combination to make those decisions, right? But there's a prescribed way to do that. And through the model called ICS, or Incident Command Systems, Erie County utilizes a unified command structure to make the policies and process and set the mission and standards for that operational period in the disaster of which we are responding to. What that looks like truly is we're out at the facility at 3359 Broadway in Cheektowaga together, a group of policymakers, county executive, the emergency managers locally, a representative from the state, the city, and they work together to come up with policies and set the priorities for, again, that day. And it can be a little tricky though. So it's like, okay, cool, we have a group of policymakers in a room, they're trying to make decisions, but that doesn't really tell us, the community, how they're making decisions, or what kind of criteria they're using to make these decisions. So I just wanted to share a little bit about kind of what that looks like, or hope to give some insight to that. As I mentioned, that policy group of Unified Command gathers, and that's where they outline those objectives for a 12-hour operational shift period. They help to divide up the shifts that way so that we can have relief and that we can have a consistent flow of redundancy, meaning people who can come in and replace the jobs that we need to continue to get the work done during a disaster response. And so that's why we stagger them into 12-hour shifts. And always the first priority is triage life safety needs first. And then this is really where our role as service providers starts to take shape, is life safety needs first. But what's interesting is that as disasters grow and evolve, or hopefully grow down or kind of demobilize, as we say, we hope to see that the needs don't change dramatically, but we're mostly prepared to address the most important needs first, meaning access to medical and critical infrastructure facilities. Road clearance priorities are typically assigned in tandem with tasks, again, all triage with life safety needs first and prioritized in that way. One of the things that becomes complicated is that's a big ask, right? Life safety needs. That's huge, right? There's medical life safety needs. There's mental health life safety needs. There's physical life safety needs. Like, how do we all address all of those needs? And that's where the Department of Homeland Security Emergency Services really relies on folks like myself, like the folks who have attended the session, who have an interest in preparedness, to take a second and say, well, where do we fit in, and what does that mean? Because ultimately, we are the help until the help comes. And so, what do we do to be able to help ourselves in that space of promoting life and safety needs? And really, it kind of becomes a conversation of whose job is it then, right? Whose job is it to prepare when we have an office of civil preparedness, as it used to be called, or we have programs that are specifically designed for New York State to prepare? Whose job as a community is it to prepare us? Ultimately, it's on us. I mean, it's a stark reality to think about, but it's important because if we take a minute to say, this is something I can do as me, and this is something I can do with people, then it becomes a much less intimidating process. And there's a lot of tools and resources out there. When we talk about preparedness, we're really looking at it within a framework of the emergency management and disaster cycle, which is including that preparedness, response, mitigation, and recovery. And I say that because those are the four main factors in that overall disaster management, emergency management cycle. And if I had to argue, well, I shouldn't say that. I would offer that the most exciting part of my job that I am looking forward to getting into is the mitigation aspect of it. So, what are those things that we can do to prevent the long-term negative impacts of disaster exposure? That's mitigation. However, I can't get to that stuff yet because we have a lot of work that we need to do in preparedness, meaning organizations need a lot of work to become prepared. We as individuals need a lot of work to do to become prepared. The government has recognized that there's a lot of work that we need to do to be better prepared and to increase our effective communication. And so, really, when we look at as service providers, as human connectors, and as those people that connect people to service, there are opportunities to focus on preparedness. But I want to kind of take that back a little bit because there's a big expectation in preparedness. There's a lot that comes with that. And when we talk about it in emergency management, it means some pretty specific things. It means that, I'm supposed to go out and provide assessment, planning, and preparation and evaluation and do these things. And that's great, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we're there yet. That doesn't mean we have things to assess or we have things to even plan for. But if we look at preparedness, just very generally speaking, it's really just putting us in a place where we're ready and maintaining a phase of readiness. And that's not saying that we're on edge. It just means that we have things in place to be ready if we needed to. FEMA and the Department of Homeland Security do have a pretty specific definition of what it means to be prepared. But really, it's that continuous cycle of planning, organizing, equipping, exercising. And to me, the most important part of that definition is not the individual task or call to order, but the idea that it's a continuous cycle. It's an idea that this is something that we may have to continuously approach in partnership with the community and in partnership with the people that we're serving. All right, so let's talk about it. Let's talk about how to be prepared. Again, we are service providers, and I use that term very generally as people who are working with other folks in the community. And if I had to offer like three main tenets that would be the most helpful in terms of what you can do today to help be more prepared for tomorrow and to better equip your clients, are these: is one, have multiple ways to get information, but know where that information is and where to get it from. Unfortunately, I have become very habit bound to my phone. I almost never listen to the radio or the TV, and it absolutely impacts my overall situational awareness. I come into work and I find that I am not able to carry conversations, and maybe Amy and Kathleen might be able to joke, but sometimes it's difficult because I'm not consuming multiple sources of information for me to know what's going on in the world. So I seem a little siloed at times. But in a disaster, that's even more important. That's even more important when we know that inclement weather is coming. Also taking a minute to prepare your household, but also your place of business. Is there anything you need at the office just in case? I keep an extra hat and gloves in my drawers just in case. And really it's that theme of you are the help until the help gets there. Unfortunately, during last year's blizzard, we saw that emergency services were unable to respond, and that has never happened before, ever, where police and fire and emergency personnel, EMTs, mental health workers could not get to the people that needed the help. And so when we talk about being the help until help arrives, it's serious, but it's important. And I only say it to say it's that serious because we know where to build up from there, right? We know now how bad it could be. So let's talk about how to put things in place to prevent that from being that again, essentially. And in order to do that effectively, we need to take another step back to understand what's going on to us as humans when we're stressed. And I'm going to speak about stress and emergency reactions very broadly, to say that how we respond to other humans experiencing stress is really particular, meaning it kind of varies from person to person, but ultimately as an individual addressing the needs of another human, those life safety needs are first. So what do we do typically in the world of service providers when we think about how we provide safety? Some of the things I were thinking about is the electronic or telephonic support that we provide, the talk therapy, sometimes in the developmental disability world, the actual support or the type of safety work that we might do maybe includes the people around the individual, not the individual themselves. So there's a lot that we are currently doing on a day-to-day or space-to-space basis with clients, with individuals, to ensure that they're safe. We practice coping skills. We do lethality checks. We send welfare checks. We do medication counts. We integrate coping skills. We do planning with family. There's a lot that we do on a day to day or on an interaction to interaction basis with clients that will be very helpful. But there's some specific things that we can do when they are experiencing heightened stress or when there's an incoming kind of pending disaster. But it's on us to know what those things are and when to apply them. And that's the key. And that's kind of what becomes difficult. So in order to kind of give you folks here listening some insight to that is what's going on for us when we're highly stressed during a disaster, during a snowstorm, during a traumatic incident within a community, what's going on in our brain. And forgive me for repeating myself for those of you who might be familiar, but my point in illustrating what's going on in the brain and in the ignition of the amygdala in the stress response is that the energy from the prefrontal cortex is being in common theological replications, withdrawn from the prefrontal cortex and focused into the amygdala so that our bodies can jump into this flight, fight, or freeze response and do what we need to in order to keep ourselves physically safe. But to me, as a disaster responder, the most important aspect of that process is the reduction of the energy from the prefrontal cortex. And what that means is our ability to regulate our thoughts, our emotions, and our behavior really is impacted. And to what level that's impacted is going to vary, but we become irrational because it's quite literally just neurochemistry, right? And not everybody has that response. The responses widely vary, but that shift in energy from the prefrontal cortex to the amygdala to activate that flight, fight, or freeze is really important. Because if we know there's weather coming and we know that our clients may have a little incident of trauma from their previous 2023 weather storm system or any other weather system or any other trauma in their life, if we know they're becoming stressed, it's incumbent upon us to educate them, to know what the possibilities and the impact of that stress response could be. And unfortunately, I say unfortunately because that range of possibilities is truly endless. we have moved in our mental health system now to look at diagnoses on a spectrum. And I'm grateful for that advancement. But it doesn't just apply to diagnoses in terms of the experience within them. That also is big here. And how we experience stress and what that looks like and what that means varies significantly, but also, comma, if I could, or I should say semicolon, is hugely impacted by culture, creed, nationality, socioeconomic status. If you're in a marginalized community, if you've been targeted, a victim of violence, there are so many things that also contribute to this cocktail truly of a chemical response that it's important that in our work we are mindful of this so that as we do move to talk to clients about how we can keep them safe, how we can keep them prepared, what we can do, how we talk to their family systems. And when I mean family, I don't necessarily mean nuclear, but who those who are identified as family, when we go to engage with those individuals, knowing that this sort of conversation may induce this stress or that they might go through stress in the incident or the disaster is also an important part of educating.
Sarah, I have one question that came in if you have a minute
Yeah,
for
of
it.
course. Sorry, I know I've been going, so please.
We have someone who put in that not many of the housing customers at RSI have the income for phones or extra services for notifications for emergencies.
Great
How
question.
can the barrier be managed with low or no cost methods?
Yeah, so it is, and that's a super great question. I have a lot of thoughts, concerns for housing needs in general and safety. Um, so it's so tough because my gut reaction is the simplistic answer of, well, let's get them a radio, right? Like, there are, of course, there are things that we can do, but there's really not. However, I say that to say my first suggestion would be to look at the opportunities internally within an organization if there are emergency lines or emergency preparedness requirements within any of the grants or some of the housing requirements. Are there any, options to be able to procure alternative items and have them available during times of emergencies? So that's one. Not great, I understand that, but that is an option. Two, not great, but we try to rely on print sources. And the heavy sigh is because now with Buffalo News moving to Cleveland, we're unsure of the reliability of that, but we rely too on some local print sources. If they can get people in and if they can get people to their shop locations. TV, of course, radio, yes, but again, we do recognize that we're hitting a bit of a hurdle there now with technology. And so while I don't have a super specific answer for you at this moment, that is an area of, okay, we need to address that because you're right. So I don't have a specific answer now, but I'd love to do some more follow-up work on that. Truly. All right. Keep them coming though. I appreciate it. So as I had mentioned, there's a range in experience after, during, before disasters. And I say disasters, but I'm truly talking about, again, incidents of widespread inclement weather or community violence or tragic episodes. But it's important for us to remember, and the timing of that question was perfect to me. So I think maybe you did that on purpose. Sorry. Was really the equity of all this. Now I'm just linking it together, thank you. Is really the equity of all this, because for people of, as the example just provided, low socioeconomic status, people are living in emergent circumstances every single day, right? So to that point, it's not fair for me to sit here and just say, well, go get a AM FM crank radio, because there's a cost to that. It's not easy to procure that, and all of those sorts of things. So that's why when we talk about preparedness, it's on us to really look at the person, the individual, the community that we're interacting with, the community that we're engaging with, and think about those expectations that we have. And we have come to recognize, when I say we, I mean our Erie County response team, we've come to recognize that we have a need to be the ones to ensure that there's an equitable lens in the response, to ensure that the volunteer organizations who are rooted in community block clubs have the opportunity to have access to information. So we've worked on expanding some of those wings and umbrellas. But the other issue that we're kind of working with is, what are the expectations that the community has of us, right? Is if I could put a preparedness package in every single group home, licensed, unlicensed, residential, I would. And then I would come out and do a training. But is that practical? And is a kit the answer? Or is it, how do I teach a community to care for itself? Meaning, how do I teach a community to become resilient? How do I come in and instill in a community so that even if there's an individual within the community itself who can't keep themselves safe or provide their own care, what can that community do to surround that individual? And before I move on, I just want to throw out a huge plug to our Office of Health Equity. If you go to Erie County, and maybe Kathleen, I should have told you ahead of time, I'm sorry. If somebody would be willing to throw it in the chat for me. Thank you, Amy. The Office of Health Equity at Erie County, at the bottom of their webpage, they have some great preparedness resources that you can print out that are translated in, I believe, 6 different languages. So I just want to make sure to offer that here to folks. There's information on winter preparedness resources and some safety information that would be really helpful. But coming
One
back
more.
to, go ahead.
Go ahead. I was going to say I have another question. So
Yeah,
whenever
please.
we have another question. People with intellectual and developmental disabilities who live in the community, many of them rely on staff to support them. Getting through driving bans can be problematic. Please address how agencies can help with this.
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, I'm going to put that up with this slide. So I'm going to kind of jump to that question, and equity will kind of continue to be a theme. I don't want to leave that hanging on a cliffhanger like I just did. I thought I had a smoother transition there, so I'll come back. But to answer that question, that is very tough. And currently, we are working on producing a set of guidelines. I actually have reviewed it, so it is actually happening, I'm happy to say. A set of guidelines for organizations on information they can use to triage who they would like to consider within their operational capacity, essential or not. Part of the problem we noticed as the Department of Homeland Security post-COVID was who was deemed essential really changed. Meaning there was one job title that could have been essential during COVID, but maybe because of needs, that individual in their job role at the time is not essential. However, we have noticed, to that question in that example, residential home workers are kind of always critical because of that need. So one of the things that we're doing, and I don't have a great answer for this, is working in partnership with the sheriff's office so that they understand. And when I say that, I can say that as an example because the sheriff works right within that policy room with that group of policy leaders. So during an event and during a disaster, the opportunity to work with the sheriff and say, we don't want to enforce travel bans for individuals who present their badge and they're going to a residential home. Now, we have tried this before, and the big time caveat and one of the big time issues that we've noticed, and I say this with nothing but love, sometimes that message change as it goes down through different ranks and the timing of it as well. The problem in enforcement during incidents is critical and vast and complicated. And I'm almost going to I actually am going to put a pin in that question, only to say we hope to put more information out soon to be able to have organizations have more guidance to make some of those decisions on their own about who is essential and who is not. But for the actual enforcement of it, I truly just can't speak to how that will be coordinated through this upcoming season. But I'd be happy to look into it and get back to folks on that. So sorry, I don't have a better answer at this time. But there are other things that people and organizations can do to help. And that's actually a really good transition here is when we talk about equity and we talk about ensuring that we're preparing communities, folks, and individuals to be prepared and to have those individual aspects ready. we're really looking at where to get that credible and real-time information. Organizations, one of the biggest things organizations can do during a disaster or leading up to a disaster is making sure that 211 has updated information about what the operations within your organization will look like during the disaster. So if there are changes in terms of information access or service accessibilities, that sort of information would be really helpful to go to 211 because they will be a large partner in helping the county distribute information during upcoming disasters. But to build on that equity model, but truly the equity of promoting resilience so that communities are able to remain prepared, is looking at it from a perspective of the circle of support, which is not a theme or an idea that I came up with. This was truly a concept born out of the service community, oftentimes cited out of the developmental and intellectual disability community as a way to really empower a person to make sure that they have the resources necessary to go through the treatment challenges and reach life goals and those sorts of things. However, the model has been adapted into a lot of different applications. And when we talk about community resilience, there isn't a better model to me that looks at how we as service providers can utilize the resources of the individual, whether we are engaging directly with them or not, to surround that person and that community with the support they need. A lot of that is in the work up until and before a disaster. And so when we talk about these things and we talk about how are we really surrounding individuals with support ahead of time, how are we supporting resilience, how are we making sure that the neighbor who's 2 feet next door, who maybe is 94 years old, but I'm physically capable, I can go look at her vent because she's a neighbor and she's part of my kind of inherent circle of support. And that's really where it becomes important on us to know these things, right? As service providers and as folks who are engaging with others on the community, that's where we have the power to provide and share and access that information. Ultimately, at the end of the day, I could tell you about the perfect preparedness kit, and I could tell you about the perfect how-to response. And if you get a gas fire, actually, I can't tell you how to put out a fire. That is an area I'm very weak at. I am fascinated by it, but I can't tell you any of that. But truly, when it comes to preparing folks and helping folks through disasters and inclement weather disasters and all sorts of things, it's just about remembering when people are highly stressed, they may not be functioning at their best. And maybe we just need to be human. And what is the best intervention for that is timely and accurate information. When somebody is very stressed, often accompanying that is a feeling of loss of control. And if we can give an individual information to help them feel a state of control or to know what is happening around them so that they can make a decision, we have now empowered that individual to be able to regain a sense of control and to be able to start that process of recovery. But that's incumbent upon us to know. It's incumbent upon us to recognize that there is a reaction from potentially a disaster that is occurring and what information to give that individual. But it also means that we don't need to be talking about preparedness at every single client interaction, right? Um, I had a client, or excuse me, a colleague of mine in Homeland Security asked me, he said, "Are you going to make every mental health clinician talk about preparedness during their therapy sessions?" Um, no, that doesn't sound like a good time for anybody, so no. But what I'm thinking about is if you have that client who just won't talk, who is just coming in, they're having a funky day, or you're going out into the community and you're interacting with family and all they want to talk about is the weather, is that an opportunity? Is that a moment to transition and say, it is going to be really nasty out the next couple days. What are you going to do if you get stuck somewhere? We're talking about moments of filler and using those as opportunities to talk about how people are doing. But even during crisis engagement or even during like an active emergency, it's the same way. If we're responding to a scene of an incident of community violence that's impacting a small group of people, still information is power, and informing the individual what you know to be true, telling the individual what's going on in their brain, answering the questions of why can't I, are all things that are very helpful in somebody regaining that state of control and bringing them back and putting them on that road to recovery from that stress much sooner. And I'm saying the responsibility is on us, and I don't mean to be too dramatic about it, but it kind of is, because of all of the factors that those we are working with are up against, because we are constantly interacting with individuals in marginalized community, because we are the professionals, and to be a professional means to me, bringing help and assistance to other people. So this is just one example that we can Google online. It's a little difficult to read, my apologies, but I'm sure it'll be available when we send out the slides. But there's a variety of different things we can talk about to folks when we're talking about preparedness. I had mentioned earlier when we have gray sky days, meaning when we're in that phase of planning for a disaster or that active disaster response, we can talk to somebody about what that means. That's a tool that FEMA uses in some of their coloring books with kids. If we have a client who doesn't drive a car, but they constantly have a backpack on them, I would be curious if they're maybe carrying around an extra pair of socks in that backpack. Or do we have a bin at work? Or better yet, if I don't have any resources available to me as the client, or excuse me, as the professional, can I tell that client this year, and I don't know this for fact, so don't quote me, is the NFTA giving out free socks this year? So if you find yourself in a bind, you might want to go check out the NFTA's bus terminal for socks. It's knowing those communal resources so that we can then empower people to be able to access those resources when they need to. Oh, excuse me. That's some of the things that I was talking about. The other thing that I want to mention is preparedness for pets. Don't underestimate it. There are a variety of pets who could use a variety of preparedness items, but sometimes individuals think about them as well. And I'm not saying that our folks need to procure extra, food or items or dog food, but that might be part of the conversation. Is your animal helpful for you during a disaster? Or what are the needs around your pet lizard for the disaster? How will you keep your lizard warm if it's your safety animal and the light goes out? These sorts of things are another conversation starters. Know where to get that credible information. 211, 311, 858 SNOW, the National Weather Service. It's important that we also take the time to educate folks where to go, but also, most importantly, where to not go to get information. Anytime there's disasters or an incident, and I just fell victim of it with the incident on the Rainbow Bridge this last week. The rumor mill on that was intense and fierce and went really, really fast. And what we learned is it was not at all what we initially anticipated. So it's an important lesson for us in emergency response to be mindful about what information we're consuming, but also what information we put out, what information we share, and where we tell people to get information. So those are some other really kind of important aspects of that preparation. And at this point, that was all the information I had that I wanted to share with you, but I really wanted to see if there were other questions that I can address and any other conversation.
Sure. One comment that came in was that professionals can also experience the stress responses. We need to support each other as well.
Yes, thank you. And forgive me, can't believe I missed that whole, yeah, cannot. And I put on there and I can't believe I glossed over it, the concept of a disaster buddy. People laugh. I don't laugh at that. I take the disaster buddy concept very seriously, especially for those that respond or do work during disasters. It's important for everybody. The concept basically is, if we're about to go through something very scary, who's my person that I can call that we can kind of talk about that experience with? If you're a responding individual, that person that you're responding with is often very helpful, because no two people will truly experience a disaster or a weather event the same. Whether you're in Lancaster or out here in Colden, the experience is vastly different. So that proximity to somebody that you can have to lean into is really helpful.
Thanks, sir. Another question. What is helpful to keep in our cars?
Love that question. Okay, right off the bat, pair of gloves. Don't care what kind, but just another pair of gloves. because everybody wants to get out to, either clear off some more snow or something. A pair of gloves, preferably that are not cotton. Go to the Dollar Tree. Dollar Trees are your best friend in prep because you can get yourself some of those, like, I think they're nylon-y sort of gloves. They're $1.25 now, but they're still worth it. Um, Outside of gloves, I would highly recommend like a bottle of water or two. Don't, one, I hate to be a little particular about it, but one bottle per season. If you let it sit there over the summer, it can get a little nasty. But I would throw an extra bottle of water or two in your car. Some granola bar is really helpful. The other last kind of three things that I would highly recommend are a blanket, a candle, and like some lighter to light it, and a can, believe it or not, and something to cut the can. And I say that because here's your little fun survival tip from Sarah. You put the candle on the aisle or in the middle. If you have one of those cars with the thing in between the seat, you just put the candle on the flat surface, preferably near the window, so you're not burning anything on top. So you're not burning the roof of your car. And then you cut the can in half, put the can on it, and it will radiate the heat in the car if you run out of gas. And it also can be used as a signal for first responders if they're trying to find you in your car. Those would be my top recommendations. And also make sure your gas tank is above half. I'm guilty of that daily.
Another comment that came in about the personal preparedness, thanking Amy, I would like to advocate personal preparedness for ourselves first because we cannot put the oxygen mask on others if we're not breathing ourselves.
Yeah, very, very much so. And I truly don't think I stress that enough. So thank you.
Another question, how can RAP plans be integrated into a weather or disaster event?
Ooh, I love that. So it's been a minute, forgive me, since I've worked with a physical, tangible RAP plan with all the specifics to it. However, I can think of a couple different areas of disaster planning. That pre and then recovery, but not the initial response sort of stuff. Kathleen, I didn't want to, I know that's something you work with as well, right? The RAP plans.
Yeah, that question came in from Heidi. I don't know if she wants to expand on that.
Yeah, I'm wondering, Heidi, if you're thinking about a particular aspect of the RAP plan. Like, forgive me, I can visualize some of the elements, but if there's a particular part of them you're thinking about.
So the RAP plans are the wellness recovery action plans,
Right.
is what Heidi said.
I can think of I guess my problem is I can think of a bunch of different areas where it could be, either in an annual review or even just like a refresher or an individual one for disasters. Like there's a couple different iterations I could see being helpful. Or even the concept to, do a disaster RAP type plan for a team, a response team too. It's not a super specific answer, but if you have something like a specific area in there you're thinking about, I'd be happy to talk offline too about it.
Someone else commented in having a disaster buddy, like mentioned, is in line with the RAP philosophy.
Oh, I did that on purpose. No, I wish I could say I did, but thank you.
And then Heidi also said, we use RAP plans for mental health crisis, but what about a disaster plan for having no heat at home?
Yeah. So that it's tough. So, and it's the tough thing is it's so individualized by incident. So we run into this a little bit in the planning sector of emergency services. Is we call it an all hazards approach. We to educate people to not plan for a specific incident. So for today, for example, I was talking about weather a lot because there happens to be a weather experience happening, but we really suggest people to plan for all hazards. I mean that to say there could be a variety of incidents that cause that electricity to go out. If the individual were experiencing a blizzard that caused their heat to go out, the best and possible most safe option may be for that person to remain in their home, because even though the temperature in their home might be 25 degrees, it is safer in that home than the blowing hurricane force winds outside to try to get to a warming shelter that may or may not be operational. If it's a flood and the flood's coming to that person's house, maybe they absolutely need to be able to get out of there. So a wrap plan in to that incident would be different, or does that, excuse me, or any disaster plan would be a little bit different. So I only say that to say, in that sort of scenario, the question is, how do we tell the person, how do we educate the person to help keep themselves warm in their home for 24 hours if they were to lose electricity? Because it's a very real reality that they might face. So, do they need to accrue more blankets? Do they live with other people? And we're talking about life safety. So, do the residents need to, and I know this is difficult, and I'm not saying within every home, but do they need to gather in one space to keep each other warm? And so, really looking at situationally dependent needs, if that makes sense.
Great. Thanks, Sarah.
Yeah, absolutely. I hope it answered the question, but keep them coming, Heidi, if it didn't, because I don't want to leave it unanswered.
Yeah, I think that was what I saw for questions.
Okay.
And I know we're approaching 1 o'clock here. So wanted to say thank you, Sarah. That was fantastic and very helpful information. Thanks, Amy, for coordinating, and thanks everyone for participating. Amy did post the link for the evaluation in our chat box. So we ask you to just take a moment or two to complete that survey for us. She's also posted the link to our website for our previous trainings, and that will be where the slides and recording from today's presentation will be posted. We'll have that out in the next few days. Again, if you're interested in being a presenter, please let Amy know. Or if you have ideas for topics you'd like to learn more about, we'll like to know that too. Again, thank you so much, Sarah, for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you, guys. I appreciate it. If anybody has any questions or needs, please feel free to reach out to me.